Hey, what is up, everybody? Welcome to Mythical Legend Monday here on Where All the Ladies At. This is a podcast, obviously, and it's about basically I deep dive into history and try to figure out where the fuck all the women went, because there's not a lot of us in the history books, and I think there probably should be. On Mondays, I have 2 episodes a week. And by the way, I am Kim, your friendly host and history nerd and writer and lover of history, all of that good stuff. Here on this podcast, I do 2 episodes a week. Monday is Myth and Legend, and Thursdays talk about historic figures. This month, for the goddesses and the legends, we are focusing on Illyrian goddesses. And if you're not sure where Illyria is, either you haven't watched the previous podcast or listened, or you're new here. And if that's the case, just hold on tight, because we'll talk about where the Illyrians lived and who they were. That's what I'm trying to say. Use your words. And then on Thursdays, this month I am covering warrior queens, or queens that really expanded their empire and did great things. This week is a big one for me on Thursday. I'm covering King Tamar. That's right, a queen that became a king. And the reason it's so big is because I actually live in the country that she ruled, which is called Georgia or Sakartvelo, depending on who you are. And Georgia, when I say Georgia, most people talk about the state, but this is a country. So I'm super excited about that one. So make sure you guys tune in for that. Today, we are focusing on Ika, and I think that's how you say it. It's Ika, the Illyrian goddess sorry, my brain just had a moment. It's one of those days, guys. The Illyrian goddess of fertility. So yay, fertility. Always good to have that, right? But before we jump into the Illyrians and the goddess, my hair is a hot mess. All right, I'm trying new things with stuff, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, guys. Anyways, before we do that, let's do some housekeeping and shameless plugging. If you want to reach out to me, you can do that via social media or even an email. Those are in the description box. If you want to support the podcast, you can do that as well. If you don't have cash to do that, that's more than okay. Just like, comment, share, follow, subscribe, do all that kind of stuff. I would really appreciate it. The more you interact with the video or the audio, the more the algorithms say, hey, people like her. Maybe more people would like her. And then they show me to more people, and we can build more of a community. If you do have some cash and you want to kick it my way, never going to turn that down. There's ways to do that in the description box as well. You can look at my Buy Me a Coffee or my Patreon. Either one is there. Also, if you want more information on this particular goddess and much more, you can check out the Medium publication. And if you are into magical, mystical, spiritual kind of woo-woo kind of stuff, you might want to check out my other podcast. There's a link to that as well. It's called Our Mystic Road Trip, and we cover things like candles, herbs, ley lines, altars, astrology, and all kinds of that stuff like that, as well as we're going to start covering a little bit more life coaching, holistic health, spirituality, mindset, and mindfulness as well. All right, I think that's it for the shameless plugging. So now let's jump into Ika, the Illyrian goddess of fertility. All right, so I said I would talk to you about who the Illyrians were and where they're from. And that's what I'm going to do. By the way, if you're new here and you see me look down, it's because I'm old. I can't remember all this stuff. I'm looking at my notes and my scripts. So, hey. And if you're on podcast, I don't do that. No, that's not true. I do that. I'm real upfront with you guys. All right, so Illyrians, right? So these are like an ancient group of people that lived in the Western Balkans. So modern day Albania, Montenegro, Croatia, a little bit of Bosnia, Herzegovina, that area, right? That is where the Illyrians were. They were pretty well known for being warriors, and that's kind of something that really defined them in history. They came up against the Roman Empire, they came up against the Greeks, they came up against all kinds of people, and so they had to be pretty strong, and that was men and women. So they were also very deeply connected to nature, as most of the old cultures, right? They obviously aren't as well known as the Greek and the Romans, but that doesn't make them any less important. That area of the world is actually really pivotal in a lot of movement, right? So here on Where Are the Ladies At, obviously, we focus on the ladies. So what was it like for the ladies of Illyria? Well, they had the same basic duties as they did before, but, with other, they needed to take care of the families, but, all of that was added with the warrior, right? So the women in Illyrian culture had a very prominent role when it came to that aspect, the military presence, right? A lot of the times in some cultures, and as we're going through, we're noticing less and less, but the role of a warrior was really just pigeonholed for the men, right? But not in Illyria, right? Their women weren't just wives and mothers. They were out there. They held land. They had property rights. They had a voice in religious matters. They really weren't passive when it came to anything, right? Sorry, I moved my notes too far. In fact, we'll talk about more archaeological stuff later, but there's been a lot of archaeological finds, or a few, where the women were actually buried with weapons. And that kind of shows, like, if women were buried with weapons, the words are not coming out. the kind of thought behind that means that they were probably warriors, right? The translation into their religion held the same sway, right? We've talked about several of the goddesses already, and if you haven't seen those, I suggest go back. Anzodica and Nibra were both pretty badass goddesses, right? So here you go. You have goddess fertility and the harvest, right? Because most of the time, fertility goddesses and harvest goddess go hand in hand. And that shows that the importance of the female, right? So there's a strength to be had there. So Ica is kind of like a prime example, and we'll go into that. So let's actually jump into Ica now that you kind of have an idea. So honestly, like, Illyrians were just kind of in that region of the world. They were pretty badass. If you haven't listened or watched last Thursday's episode, I think you should go back and do that, because the queen that I talked about last week was Tuta, and she was the pirate queen of the Illyrians, and man, she was no joke. So if you want more information on Illyrians and actually in real life and kind of historical presence, I suggest go back and check that out. But right now we're going to talk about Ica. So Ica is a fertility goddess, as I said, and in Illyrian mythology, she kind of held the dominion over that, right? She had a divine touch. She could ensure crops grew, animals thrived. Humans were blessed with the ability to reproduce, because in those old societies, that was pretty important, right? She was responsible for making life happen, right? But though we focus on the fertility aspect, she was also she was a vital part of, like, Illyrian religious beliefs, right? Life and nature. So once again, kind of a dualistic thing, the cycle of life. This was what she was, right? Because the Illyrians had such a deep respect for the earth and its cycles, this goddess in particular had a pretty big play in it. But Here's the thing, and this is what I said in a couple of the other ones. There's not a lot of written text. So a lot of what is written about Ica is conjecture, and it's also found by outside sources, right? So you have to kind of play with it, right? You have archaeological findings, artifacts and that. But even though there's like this not as much written about her, it's very clear from the things that have been found that she was pretty significant, right? And it makes sense. It doesn't matter what culture or region of the world you're in, a fertility goddess is going to be pretty important, right? Her power was tied directly to the fundamental aspects of existence, right? Growth and birth and continuity, right? It was something that the Illyrians really gravitated towards. And in fact, most of the older cultures and regions really did that. Once again, let me repeat, though there's not a lot of stories about her, it doesn't take away her importance, right? Her influence wasn't necessarily based on grand mythological narratives. It was more of a everyday connected to the tangible aspects of life. And maybe that's why there's not as much known about this goddess, right? Now we got a sense of who Ica was. Let's talk about how she was represented and how she was worshipped, right? Once again, let me repeat, this is all conjecture because we don't really have a definitive, this is how they were done. We don't have that. We have to piece together. And this is where, once again, I'll repeat, and I will say till the day I am dead, archaeologists are heroes because they literally have to take these little pieces of puzzles and try to figure out what we're doing. Hold on, let me get some tea. Good stuff. All right. So, she is the goddess of fertility, right? So you can kind of go with the typical ideology of what a fertility goddess is, right? It's all about renewal. So for her, settlements really revolved around things of growth and rebirth, right? Flowers, trees, the sun, these are all symbols that kind of were a nod to the cycle. And for sure, Ica had some domain over them, right? When the seasons changed, when the crops grew, when life flourished, that was all Ica. The Illyrians weren't really ones to worship gods and goddesses through mere words and prayers. They really kind of had a hand-on and practical method, as once again did a lot of the ancient cultures. For Ica, you'd probably find offerings of food and flowers, animal sacrifices maybe. And they weren't just there to appease her, they were there to celebrate her role in sustaining life, right? They didn't want to just wait for the rainfall or the crops. They wanted to show the goddess that they were, obedient, I guess, or respectful of her abilities. And that way they could ensure there was a balance of nature stayed out. Now, archaeologists have found shrines and altars dedicated to fertility gods throughout the Illyrian region. The site is obvious that, her role in daily life was pretty present. These were probably used for small rituals, and probably would have, much like many of the others, would probably have had their religions, their religious ceremonies done in key times of the year, right? So, especially in relation to the agricultural calendar, right? Because she is a fertility goddess, so of course that's what she's going to look at. And once again, there's not a wealth of information, right? So the physical evidence of these shrines kind of tell us that there's some importance put on the connection between fertility and their everyday life. So, I mentioned a couple pieces of archaeological evidence, right? So let's talk about archaeological evidence. There aren't stacks of ancient texts, like I said, and there is some solid archaeological evidence that suggests fertility, like Ica played kind of a central role. Archaeologists have uncovered sacred groves, fertility symbols, inscriptions that all kind of point to this really deep appreciation for Earth's natural cycles, right? Which makes sense, that their whole life depended on the cycles. Back then, all the cultures, no matter where you were in the world, depended on the cycles of nature. It just was, right? And so fertility wasn't really an abstract concept. It was survival. So they needed good harvest. They needed strong livestock. They needed families, right? And that's where Ica came in. Well, I can't say for sure every fertility symbol or carving was directly related to her. There is a general prevalence of fertility-related depictions that suggest a goddess, like her with major figure, right? Female figures were carved in stone and depicted, often in other materials. They're found all kinds of in sacred sites. Sorry guys, my nose is itching. It's a weird time of year where I don't really have allergies, but my nose itches. It's weird. And so, where was I? Oh, yes. These little carven figures of female deities obviously represent Earth and life-giving forces, right? But it gets interesting. During the height of her worship, the Illyrians were living in a period where the culture was kind of marked by tribal structures. So, but also increasingly by powerful kingdoms that were kind of competing for dominance in the Balkans, right? And this is a time when the Illyrians were kind of faced with a lot of influence from the Greeks and a lot of influence from the Romans, depending on the period of time. And these two mighty empires had their own deities, right? So even though they did, and they were kind of encroaching in on the Illyrian place, the Illyrians still maintained kind of their own unique set of beliefs. And that's kind of different. Archaeological evidence kind of points to a time when the Illyrians were very firmly rooted in their ancient traditions, right? Like I said, there were sacred groves, all these things. So in these groves, it's not hard to imagine that there were probably some, rituals and ceremonies done in honor of Ica. Interestingly, what I would say is that, they found things with her symbols, flowers, trees, all that kind of carved and all that kind of stuff. But it was also a warrior culture. So while a lot of the Illyrians are more well known for their battle stuff and their constant, battling back and forth with the Greeks and the Romans as their empires started to expand, they were also pretty much about nurturing life too, right? So once again, not a lot of written anything, but you have to piece it together, and so Ica, kind of becomes this entity that plays a big role, right? Renewal of life and growth and all of that. Her power wasn't just about to ensure the harvest. It was in a way that she embodied the forces of what the Illyrian people needed, right? And began people going, sacred forests, fertility symbols, all that. You couldn't have warriors if there was no fertility, right? Because first of all, warriors need to eat, so you need good crops, you need good herds, and also you need replenishment because guess what? Warriors die, warriors get old, so you need that fertility as a major part of your life. And Ica was the one to get it. Now, I want to preface this because we're jumping into one of my favorite parts, which is the story. Once again, remember, there's not a lot written. So really, this is just me taking information and history and kind of expanding a little on it and trying to create a myth that maybe has a little bit of knowledge, but I expand upon it, if that makes sense. So here we go. As usual, it is story time, so grab your beverage of choice, whether that be a cocoa or a cocktail, and your blanket, and curl up, and let me tell you a story about the myth of Ica and the first spring. Long, long ago, when the world was still young, and the winds howled like untamed spirits across the barren lands of Illyria, the earth was quiet, still, and unyielding. There were no flowers to paint the hills in colors, no trees to give shade to weary travelers, and no rivers to sing their soothing songs. The mountains stood cold and unblessed, their icy peaks ruling over a land that seemed to forget the warmth of life itself. The people of Illyria, weary of the relentless cold and silence of the land, raised their voices in prayer. With hands clasped, they offered sacrifices to the gods, food, incense, and precious gifts. Yet the skies remained silent. The gods did not answer, and the earth, unshaken, refused to stir. But among the heavens, there was one who could not ignore their cries, Ika, the goddess of fertility and nature. She heard the desperate pleas of the people, and her heart swelled with compassion. She was the goddess who could make life bloom where there was none. It was she who held the power to awaken the earth from its slumber. So Ika descended from the sky, her feet barely touching the cold ground. With each step, her feet left delicate flowers blooming in her wake. Where her toes brushed the earth, the flowers stretched upward, their colors painting the gray landscape in vibrant hues. As she moved, these flowers grew into strong trees, their branches reaching toward the heaven. The trees grew so tall and thick that they seemed to whisper secrets to the wind. And as the trees thickened into forests, the earth, once silent and still, began to hum with life. But Ika knew the land needed something more, something deep in the earth's very heart, to bring true life to the barren lands. She needed to awaken the pulse of earth itself. With great care and strength, she reached into the depths of the earth, where only the bravest would dare to venture, and she carved a sacred stone. The stone was smooth and gleaming, born from the very bones of the earth, and it glowed with the power of renewal. Ika placed the stone in the center of the land, where all life could gather around it. As soon as the stone touched the ground, the earth trembled with joy. From the heart of the sacred stone, the first river burst forth, winding its way across the land like a serpent. The waters danced and sparkled, bringing life where there was only dust and rocks. And from the river, the first spring began, its warm winds sweeping through the land, chasing away the bitter cold and heralding the return of life. The people, seeing the goddess's work unfold before their eyes, rejoiced. They danced by the river, their laughter ringing through the new forests. Flowers bloomed in fields, animals played in the shade of trees, and the earth itself seemed to breathe for the first time in centuries. Ika had not only given the land life, but had also granted it the heart that would allow it to live on year after year. And so it was that every spring, when the earth is reborn, the people of Illyria would gather to honor Ika. They would dance beneath the trees she had brought to life, offer prayers by the river she had birthed, and celebrate the warmth and fertility she had gifted them. For in the heart of the earth, there would always be Ika's presence, a reminder of the goddess who had breathed life into a barren land and given the world its first spring. And so the myth of Ika lives on in the blooming flowers, in the trees that whisper in the wind, and in the rivers that continue to flow, carrying her legacy through the ages. And that's Ika, guys. That's the goddess of fertility and nature in Illyria, the one who helped the Balkans become so beautiful, apparently. And if you've never been to the Balkans, you don't even. It is such a beautiful part of the world. I haven't been to all of it. I've been to Albania and Montenegro, and both of those countries are on my, I would say, top five places I've ever been. Because they're just absolutely beautiful. The people are beautiful. The food's good. The land is stunning. And yeah, so once again, not a travel podcast, but if you ever get a chance, go check out the Balkans and see. Try to go during spring so you can see a little bit of Ika's handiwork, right? Alright guys, that's it for this week. I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit more about another Illyrian goddess. We have one more to go next week, so make sure you turn back in and make sure you check out Thursdays because I am super pumped for this one. Thursday is King Tamar, and I have been teasing it for a while. She'd been on my rotation a couple different times, and just through life and everything just kind of didn't get to it, and this time we have it. I'm gonna do it. I cannot wait for you guys to hear about her. She's a pretty badass lady, so make sure you check out Thursdays. And yeah, guys, that's it for this week. As always, you know that you can reach out to me via my social media. You know that if you want to support the podcast, you can just simply like, share, comment, review, do all that kind of good stuff. Interact as much as you can with the audio or the video, depending on where you're watching it. And if you want to kick cash my way, there's ways to do that as well. And if you want more information, you can check out the Medium publication. And if you're into woo-woo stuff, check out my other podcast called Our Mystic Road Trip. All the information is in the description box below, guys. And as always, until next time, stay curious, stay blessed, stay safe.